On the 7th of June 1816, the House of Commons divided on whether to spend £35,000 of public money on a quantity of broken stone lying in a damp shed behind a house in Park Lane. 82 members voted to buy it, 30 voted not to. The House had 658 members. This is the story of what Britain actually paid for the Parthenon sculptures. Where the money went, what the collection had cost the man selling it, how a committee of the House of Commons arrived at a valuation, what the vote bought in law, and why that legal wording still decides the argument 2 centuries later. There is a great deal of debt in this and very little marble. Start with the year, because the year is the reason the price was so bitterly resented. Britain in 1816 was a country coming down off 22 years of war. Wheat was dear, wages were falling, soldiers were coming home to no work, and in East Anglia that summer, labourers were breaking threshing machines and burning ricks over the price of bread. 10 weeks before the vote, Parliament had thrown out the property tax. The wartime income tax, hated since the day it was introduced, was voted down in March, and with it went something in the order of £14 million a year of revenue. The Commons had just made the largest single hole in the national accounts in living memory. Then it bought sculpture. The cartoonists did not miss it. Ho! George Cruikshank published a print that summer under the title The Elgin Marbles, or John Bull buying stones at the time his numerous family want bread. That is the case for the prosecution in one line, and it was a fair line. £35,000 in 1806 is somewhere near £3 million in today's money. So the question worth asking is not whether the price was high, it is what the price was for. Nobody in that chamber was buying beauty in the abstract. They were buying a specific collection out of a specific bankruptcy on terms a committee had spent 3 months working out, and every part of that transaction is documented. Follow the money and the argument looks very different. The man selling was Thomas Bruce, 7th Earl of Elgin, a Scottish peer who had been appointed Ambassador Extraordinary to the Ottoman court in 1799 at the age of 33. The post was a prize. Britain had just driven the French out of Egypt on the Sultan's behalf, and a British ambassador at Constantinople was, for a few years, the most welcome foreigner in the empire. Elgin's original intention was modest and entirely legal. He was building a great house at Broom Hall in Fife, and he wanted drawings and plaster casts of the Athenian antiquities to guide the architecture and to improve British taste. He asked the government to pay for the artists. The government declined. He decided to pay for them himself, which is the first move in the whole story. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. Was this a purchase or was it a theft? A permit was obtained. A committee of the House of Commons valued the collection and Parliament voted the money in the open. See whether you still think the same thing by the end. Giovanni Battista Lucieri, a Neapolitan landscape painter of real reputation, was engaged in Sicily in 1800 to lead the work, with a team of draftsmen, an architect, and 2 molders. Lucieri stayed on that hill for the rest of his working life. He was still in Athens when he died in 1821, more than 20 years after being hired for what was meant to be a short commission. Casting and drawing needed access, and access needed Ottoman permission. In July 1801, the embassy chaplain, the Reverend Philip Hunt, obtained a letter from the acting Grand Vizier addressed to the authorities in Athens. The original of that letter has never been found. What survives is an Italian translation, and its most important sentence is the one that was later read out in Parliament. The workmen were not to be hindered, it said, in taking away any pieces of stone with inscriptions or figures. That single clause is the legal foundation of everything that followed. It was written to cover fragments lying in the rubble around the Acropolis, which was then a Turkish garrison town with a mosque inside the ruined temple, and it was used to take down sculpture that was still attached to the building. The first metope came down at the end of July 1801, and once it had, the character of the project changed completely. Casts are cheap. Removal is an engineering operation. Elgin's men were now hiring gangs of labourers, building windlasses and scaffolds, cutting away the marble backing of blocks to make them lighter, and carting several tons at a time down to the harbour at Piraeus over roads that were not roads. What came off the building is precisely known because the British Museum has published it ever since. 247 feet of the frieze out of an original 524. 15 of the 92 metopes. 17 figures from the 2 pediments. Roughly half of what had survived the Venetian bombardment of 1687, taken over a decade and shipped in more than 200 cases. Every stage of it cost money, and the costs were of a kind that does not appear in a budget. Wages for the gangs, timber, rope, carts and oxen, harbour dues, and above all presents, because an Ottoman garrison commander who could stop the work tomorrow had to be given a reason not to, repeatedly, for 10 years, in cash and in goods. Then the sea took a share. In September 1802, the brig Mentor, carrying 17 cases, went down in a storm off the island of Kythera. Elgin had to hire divers from the Sponge Islands, work them season after season in deep water, and pay for a salvage operation that ran for 3 years before the last case came up. Nothing was insured. While that was going on, the ambassador himself became an expense. Travelling home overland in 1803, after the war with France restarted, Elgin was detained in France and held there for 3 years. A British peer in that position lived at his own charge, and he was doing it while a team of men in Athens went on drawing wages and a salvage crew went on diving. The money paying for all of it was, to a large extent, not his. He had married Mary Nisbet in 1799, the only child of a very rich Scottish landowner, and her fortune underwrote the early years. In 1808, the marriage ended in a public divorce. The fortune went with it. From that point, Elgin was funding a national collection on borrowed money at interest. By the time he came to give evidence about it, he put his total outlay at £74,240. That figure includes the interest he had been paying on the loans, which is the honest way to state it, because by then the debt was the collection. He had turned a private fortune, a marriage settlement, and a decade of credit into stone. So he tried to sell. In 1811, he offered the whole collection to the government for £62,440, a sum arrived at by his own accounting. The government of the day, with a war still running, offered $30,000 and no more. Elgin refused it, which in hindsight was the most expensive decision of his life. Meanwhile, the marbles sat in London, getting a reputation. They had been housed first in a shed in the garden of a house in Park Lane, damp, badly lit, and open to anyone with an introduction. Artists came in numbers. They drew there for hours. For a decade, the most influential sculpture in Britain was stacked in what amounted to a builder's yard. The painter Benjamin Robert Hayden took the young John Keats to see them in 1817, and Keats went home and wrote a sonnet about the experience of standing in front of them. That is the second thing the shed produced. The collection acquired, among people whose opinion moved other people, a standing that had nothing to do with the price anybody would pay for it. Against that, Elgin acquired a reputation of a different sort, and the man who gave it to him was Lord Byron. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, published in 1812, contains the lines that fix the case in the public mind. Dull is the eye that will not weep to see thy walls defaced, thy mouldering shrines removed by British hands. Byron went at him again in a poem called The Curse of Minerva. Consider Elgin's position. By 1815, he owned the most talked about objects in Britain. He could not sell them to a private buyer because no private buyer wanted 200 cases of architectural sculpture that would not fit in a house. He could not lend them for money. He could not break them up, and every year he held them, the interest ran on. That is a market with exactly one possible purchaser, and everyone concerned knew it. When a seller has one buyer, the price is not discovered, it is set. The only question left was what procedure the single buyer would use to set it, and Parliament, being Parliament, answered that question by appointing a committee. Parliament had form here, which mattered enormously to what happened next. In 1805, it had voted £20,000 to buy the collection of Greek and Roman sculpture assembled by Charles Townley. The year before the Elgin vote, it had bought the marbles from the temple at Versailles in Arcadia. A public price for antiquities already existed, and it was in the tens of thousands. In February 1806, the House of Commons appointed a select committee to consider whether the Elgin collection should be bought for the nation. It took evidence through the spring, and it set itself 4 questions in order. By what authority had the collection been removed? In what circumstances? What was its merit as art, and what was it worth? The first question was the awkward one, and the committee dealt with it by calling the man who had obtained the permit. Philip Hunt appeared and produced the Italian translation of the 1801 letter, since the original was already lost. He was asked whether the authority extended to taking sculpture off the building. He answered that in practice it had been used that way and had never been challenged by the Ottoman authorities. That answer was accepted, and it is worth being clear about why, because it is not a matter of the committee being careless. The Ottoman Empire was the recognized government of Greece in 1801. Its permission was the only permission there was to get, and its officials had watched the work for 10 years without stopping it. In the law of that moment, the paperwork held. The second question was subtler, and it went to the heart of the sale. Had Elgin acquired the collection as a private gentleman, or had he acquired it as His Majesty's ambassador, using an authority that belonged to the country rather than to him? If it was the second, the nation was being invited to buy something it arguably owned already. The committee concluded that he had acted privately, while noting that his office was what had opened every door. The third question, artistic merit, produced the most famous misjudgment in the history of British connoisseurship. Richard Payne Knight, a collector and the leading voice of the Society of Dilettanti, told the committee that the sculptures were not the work of the age of Pericles at all. They were Roman, he said, of the time of Hadrian, and therefore second-rate. He had said it to Elgin's face at a dinner years before. "You have lost your labor, my Lord Elgin. Your marbles are overrated. They are not Greek. They are Roman, of the time of Hadrian. He was completely wrong, and because he was the recognized authority on ancient sculpture in London, his evidence sat in the record as a discount applied to the price. Against him, the committee heard the sculptors and the painters, and they were unanimous the other way. Thomas Lawrence, Benjamin West, John Flaxman, and Joseph Nollekens all placed the marbles at the head of everything known. Antonio Canova, the most celebrated sculptor in Europe, had already declined to restore the missing limbs on the grounds that it would be sacrilege for any modern hand to touch such work. On the fourth question, the committee got the answer it had probably expected, which was that nobody could value them properly. The estimates it collected ranged from about £25,000 to well over 60, so the committee did what committees do with a spread of opinion. It reasoned from the precedents it already had and from what the public purse could be asked to bear in that particular year. On the 25th of March 1806, it reported, and it recommended that the collection be bought for the nation at £35,000. That number is the whole episode in a single figure. It is more than the Townley collection had cost 11 years earlier. It is also less than half of what Elgin said he had spent, and about £5,000 above what the government had offered him 5 years before. One thing before we go on, if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. Look at what that valuation is actually doing, because it is not an art valuation at all. The committee had no way to price a unique object, and it knew that. What it could price was a distressed seller. It set a figure high enough to be defensible as a national purchase, and low enough that a man with creditors at the door would take it. The debate came on the 7th of June, and the objection was not aesthetic. Members stood up and said what the cartoons were saying, that a country which had just abandoned the property tax and was watching bread riots in the counties had no business spending this money now. It was an argument about timing and priorities, and it was answered with the argument that the opportunity would not come again. Then something happened that almost nobody expects when they hear this story for the first time. A member called Hugh Hammersley moved an amendment. Buy the collection, he proposed, but buy it for £25,000 and hold it in trust so that it could be given back to Greece whenever a Greek government existed that was capable of asking for it and looking after it. Read that again, because of when it was said. This was 1816. There was no Greek state. The War of Independence was 5 years in the future. And a member of the House of Commons stood up and proposed, in the same sitting, that Britain buy the marbles and simultaneously accept that it might one day be holding them for somebody else. The amendment was rejected. The main motion then passed by, 82 votes to 30. £35,000 agreed in a thinly attended House on a June evening with more than 500 members not present. It is one of the most consequential votes ever taken about an object, and it was taken by about a sixth of the chamber. Nothing in the vote said anything about how the collection was to be shown, or for how long, or on what terms. The stone was moved into the British Museum and put in a temporary room the following year, and it stayed in temporary rooms for more than a century until a gallery paid for by the art dealer Joseph Duveen was built for it in the 1930s. Parliament bought the objects. It gave no instructions about them at all. The act that followed is where the money turns into something more durable than money. 56. George III, Chapter 99. An act to vest the Elgin collection of ancient marbles and sculpture in the trustees of the British Museum, not in the Crown, not in the government of the day. in a body of trustees to be held for the public. The act also did something for Elgin personally that cost nothing at all. It made him and his heirs after him trustees of the British Museum by right of the sale. He had asked to be paid in money and was, in part, paid in standing. A seat at the table of the institution that now owned the thing he had spent his fortune assembling. The 35,000 did not stay with him for long, and much of it never really reached him. He had borrowed against the collection for years, including from the government itself, and the creditors were waiting. The purchase closed a debt. It did not restore a fortune. Elgin spent the rest of his life in reduced circumstances and died in Paris in 1841, still owing money. So on the accounting of the transaction itself, nobody won. The seller recovered less than half his outlay and lost his marriage, his reputation, and his estate along the way. The buyer paid a sum that made it look heartless in a hungry year. The only party that gained unambiguously was the institution that took delivery, and it did not pay a penny. Now look at what the nation actually bought, because it was not simply a pile of marble. It bought a legal condition, vesting the collection in the trustees, put it inside the museum's foundation arrangements, and those arrangements exist to stop trustees disposing of what they hold. A trustee cannot give away trust property because he thinks it would be a fine gesture. That constraint was made much harder in the 20th century. The British Museum Act of 1963 restated it in modern terms and set out the very narrow grounds on which the trustees may part with an object at all. Duplicates, items unfit to be kept, things useless because of damage. A sculpture from the Parthenon that half the world wants to see fits none of those categories, which produces the position everybody argues about today. When Greece asked formally for the return of the sculptures in 1983, the answer that came back was not really an argument about who deserves them. It was an argument about what the trustees are permitted to do, and the trustees were telling the truth. Under the 1963 Act, they cannot simply hand them over. To return them permanently, Parliament would have to pass a new act, undoing the one it passed in 1816. That is the mechanism this episode is about. The £35,000 did not just buy the stone. It converted a private hoard, held on a disputed permit by an indebted peer, into public property under a statute, and statutes are considerably harder to reverse than opinions. It is also why every proposal that gets serious attention now is a loan, a partnership, a long-term exchange of other objects. Those are attempts to get around a legal knot without cutting it. The knot was tied on the 7th of June 1816, and it was tied by people whose main concern that evening was whether the country could afford the bill. The honest case for the purchase deserves to be put properly. The Parthenon in 1801 was a ruin inside a working fortress. It had been blown apart in 1687 when a Venetian shell reached the Ottoman powder store inside it. Fallen sculpture had been burned for lime, and pieces were being sold to travelers. Nobody was guarding it, because the state that owned it did not regard it as anything to guard. And the honest case against is just as strong, and it is not really about Byron. Elgin was the ambassador. His permit came from officials who had every reason to please the ambassador of the power that had just saved their empire in Egypt. That is not the same thing as consent freely given, and the removals plainly went beyond the drawing and casting he had set out to do. What the accounts add And what neither side usually mentions is that this was not a profitable crime. There is no version of the ledger in which somebody got rich. A man ruined himself acquiring these objects, sold them for less than half of what he had spent, and a parliament bought them in the worst possible year and got attacked for it in the press. Put the price beside the alternative that was staring at everyone that spring. £35,000 against roughly 14 million a year of income tax that the same Commons had thrown away 10 weeks earlier. The entire purchase came to about 1/400th of the revenue Parliament had just voluntarily given up. It was the cheapest thing the House argued about all year. 247 feet of frieze, 15 metopes, and 17 pedimental figures for £35,000. No British government has valued them since because they have not been for sale since. They are carried in no account, insured for no sum, and legally incapable of being priced, which is a strange fate for objects that only ever came to Britain because a man could not pay his debts. So put the answer down now. A permit was obtained from the government that ruled Athens. A committee examined the title, heard the evidence, and fixed a price. Parliament debated it in public, voted 82 to 30, and passed an act. At every stage there is a document, and at no stage was a law broken. And it is still worth asking whether that settles anything. A permit written for fragments was used on a standing building. A price was set by the only buyer in existence on a seller who could not wait. A vote was taken by 1/6 of the House. It was all lawful, and lawful is not the same word as right, which is the argument this country has been having ever since.